Mexico has sent shockwaves through the U.S. automotive industry, altering the balance of a relationship that has defined North American manufacturing for decades. What is happening now is not a minor trade dispute or a fleeting tariff skirmish. It is a structural shift that could transform how cars are made, where they are built, and ultimately how much American consumers pay at the dealership. For nearly 30 years, Mexico has been a crucial partner to the United States in the production of cars and trucks. The North American supply chain has been designed with Mexico at its heart. American brands such as Ford, General Motors, Tesla, and Stellantis, as well as Japanese and European automakers with strong U.S. market presence, have relied heavily on Mexican facilities to handle production. The reason is clear. Mexico offers cost-effective labor, a skilled workforce, efficient infrastructure, and proximity to the U.S. market that keeps transport costs low. Nearly 8 out of every 10 vehicles produced in Mexico end up crossing the border into the United States. Without this cross-border synergy, the U.S. auto industry as we know it would not exist. But today, that entire structure is being tested. A combination of new U.S. tariffs and Mexico's own protective measures has triggered uncertainty and instability. On one side, Washington has reintroduced sweeping tariffs on vehicles and auto parts entering from Mexico, arguing that such steps are necessary to protect American jobs and encourage domestic production. On the other, Mexico has responded with its own set of restrictions, limiting exports of critical parts and encouraging automakers to deepen their investment inside Mexico, rather than shipping finished products abroad. The immediate effect is rising costs. American car companies have structured their operations for decades around the assumption that Mexico would remain a reliable, low-cost manufacturing hub. Tariffs now change that equation. Vehicles assembled in Mexico that do not meet the complex rules of origin required under trade agreements are suddenly much more expensive to import. Even cars built inside the U.S. are not immune, because they rely on countless Mexican-sourced components, from wiring harnesses and transmissions to electronics and engine parts. A typical American-branded car might cross the border half a dozen times in its assembly process. Each crossing now carries the risk of added cost. For companies already struggling with inflationary pressures, rising material costs, and supply chain shortages, this comes at the worst possible moment. Automakers are still recovering from the semiconductor crisis that choked production during the pandemic years. They are simultaneously pouring billions into the transition toward electric vehicles, an undertaking that requires enormous capital, new battery supply chains, and consumer incentives to make EVs affordable. Any disruption to their finely balanced system has the potential to delay launches, reduce production volumes, and raise sticker prices. Electric vehicles in particular stand in a vulnerable position. The global race to electrify has put pressure on supplies of lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth minerals needed for batteries. The industry was already grappling with shortages and rising costs in these commodities. Now, with tariffs complicating the flow of parts across borders, EV assembly faces additional obstacles. Batteries are often partially assembled in one country and finished in another before being installed in a car. Each added tariff or restriction in that chain makes EVs more expensive to produce. For consumers who were already hesitant about higher prices for electric cars compared to gasoline vehicles, the effect could be a slowdown in adoption right at the moment when governments are trying to accelerate it. The political motivations behind these moves are also important to understand. The United States has taken a more protectionist stance, attempting to rebuild domestic manufacturing capacity and reduce reliance on foreign suppliers. Mexico, meanwhile, sees an opportunity to strengthen its own auto sector by pushing for more domestic value creation and reducing dependence on U.S. trade flows. The tension between these goals creates uncertainty for multinational automakers that have invested billions into facilities designed under a very different trade climate. Consider Ford and General Motors, both of which have sprawling operations in Mexico. These companies must now decide whether to absorb higher costs, pass them on to consumers, or relocate production back to the U.S. Relocation, however, is not simple. Building new plants in America requires time, regulatory approvals, and significantly higher labor expenses. Consumers may welcome the idea of Made in America cars, but they are unlikely to celebrate the resulting jump in prices. Automakers, stuck between political pressure and economic realities, have limited room to maneuver. Tesla faces its own unique dilemma. The company relies heavily on cost efficiency to deliver vehicles at scale while investing aggressively in new technologies and global expansion. While Tesla has factories in the US and elsewhere, the integrated North American supply chain still affects its operations. Rising costs in Mexico and tariff barriers threaten to complicate its production schedules and delay some of its more ambitious EV rollout plans. Japanese automakers that serve the US market from Mexico, such as Honda, Nissan, and Toyota, also face difficult choices. Some are already considering shifting certain models back into US plants, even at the expense of efficiency, simply to avoid tariff burdens. This would create a cascade of consequences, from plant closures and layoffs in Mexico to rising costs for American consumers. Mexico's long-term strategy, however, is not simply defensive. The government is actively encouraging domestic innovation, particularly in the field of electric mobility. New initiatives are supporting the development of Mexican-made electric buses and trucks, partially to demonstrate that the country can be more than a low-cost assembly base. While these projects are still emerging, they point to a future in which Mexico aims to carve out a more independent role in the global automotive landscape. If successful, Mexico could transform from being merely a supplier for US automakers into a competitive player in its own right. The impact on consumers is already visible. Prices for new cars have begun to rise as companies pass on additional costs. With inventory still lower than pre-pandemic levels, shoppers are finding fewer options on dealer lots and steeper price tags. Analysts warn that if tensions continue, the average cost of a new vehicle in the US could increase by thousands of dollars, placing further strain on households already coping with inflation in other areas of life. Used car prices, which surged during the pandemic due to shortages, could also remain elevated for longer, as consumers priced out of new vehicles turn to the secondhand market. For policymakers in both countries, the challenge is finding a balance between protecting domestic industries and preserving the integrated system that has made North American auto manufacturing so competitive. Decades of collaboration have created supply chains that cross borders seamlessly, but those chains are now at risk of unraveling. If they do, it could take years to rebuild the efficiencies that have made the region one of the most productive automotive centers in the world. Diplomatic negotiations are expected to intensify in the coming months. Some in Mexico are calling for an accelerated review of trade agreements to reduce uncertainty and reassure investors. American officials, meanwhile, face pressure from labor groups and domestic manufacturers to keep tariffs in place. The outcome of these talks could determine whether the industry stabilizes or slides further into disruption. Ultimately, what is happening now is more than a short-term trade spat. It is a turning point in how the US, Mexico, and Canada conceive of their automotive future. The days of effortless cross-border integration may be giving way to a more fragmented system, where each country seeks to maximize its own advantage. For automakers, this means a future of higher costs and constant strategic recalibration. For consumers, it likely means higher prices and fewer choices, at least in the near term. What remains clear is that the stakes could not be higher. The auto industry is not just another sector of the economy. It is a cornerstone of industrial capacity, innovation, and employment across North America. How this crisis is resolved will shape not only the cars we drive, but also the broader trajectory of manufacturing, trade, and energy transition in the region. Whether through renewed cooperation, deeper protectionism, or a new compromise, the decisions made today will reverberate for decades to come.